let me first tell you how honored and grateful I am to have been invited. I think it's a great pleasure to be back in Sicily. But before we start, let me see whether this works.
Migration doesn't stop. Tragedy is happening daily.
So who is left to pick up these people at sea?
They could have bought Ferraris, yachts, whatever, but they decided to take that money and put it into going out into the ocean and picking up people who are drowning.
Watch out, sit down.
It's not a crazy investment if you think that you save all these people, all this life.
I think it would be too easy for some people just to write checks for someone else to do what is definitely a core function of the state. Just because you're the smartest guy in the room doesn't mean that you're trying to make a profit every moment.
Right. I think quite a sobering start. I thought it was good to put that a little bit in perspective, what we'll be talking about. I think it's also important to kind of remember that, well, we'll be looking at all of those things analytically, and we'll be looking at numbers and so on. But of course, behind all those numbers, there are real people, people just like all of us. And I think we saw a number of things in here. I mean, we saw the kind of elements of crisis, and we'll be problematizing a little bit more what we actually mean by crisis. Crisis, in what way, by whom, which actors are involved in this. And especially if we look at the actors, I think there was something quite interesting in this video, because the video was kind of suggestive that, in a sense, the state is retreating from its responsibilities towards these people that are in very dire and very difficult circumstances. And what we're seeing is the involvement of increasing number of private actors that are involved in this, in the search and rescue here in particular. So the kind of academic discourse and academic debate that we've had, in a way, has evolved around, well, are migrants being constructed as a security threat? I mean, that's been the predominant debate, and also myself and Sarah, we very much engaged in that debate, but increasingly we see something that we hadn't anticipated, in the sense that this issue of securitization is kind of one-dimensional. It is indeed one of the trends that we can see, but when we look at the empirical reality as it plays out, what we can also see, there's a variety of different contradictory trends. Now you can hear? No, yeah. So I hope you can still hear me well. We see a variety of different contradicting trends that are some going in one direction, others going another direction. So the picture is actually rather complex. There's a kind of humanitarian trend occurring at the same time. And we've just seen some of those actors that are really getting involved in terms of trying to push this trend. So we see different things going on at the same time. Now, one of the things that was problematized was very clearly the role of the European Union, right? And in fact, a number of people have been problematizing the role of the EU institutions, the role of the different countries. I mean, you heard in the video how, in a sense, the very important operation that the Italian state had organized, the Mare Nostrum, was at the time not financed anymore, or not financed at all by the European Union. If I remember correctly, this was pre-Brexit, and at the time it was particularly the British government that said, well, we don't want this particular type of operation. Why? Well, we don't want it because we claim that this type of operation actually attracts migrants. So we don't want to rescue the ones that are coming, because we suggest that if you're doing that sort of thing, more migrants will come. So the argument was that it is contradictory. So I think in this particular case, to kind of contrast that, before we talk about the crisis, I also want to kind of show a very quick video here from the EU institutions themselves.
This is a very deep crisis. This is a crisis that is about real interest, but it's also about identity, and it's about important political principles.
We have a European Union policy which was a fair weather policy, and we were in 2015 in a perfect storm.
Je l'ai dit au Parlement luxembourgeois, la migration sera le point fort de notre présidence.
Chaque État membre seul ne pourra pas régler cette question. C'est très difficile, la situation est très difficile, mais on espère bien qu'on finira avec le temps par trouver une solution.
In the spring of 2015, we saw that we had not just the central Mediterranean route, but we also had the eastern Mediterranean route, and suddenly it was clear that we would be facing a number of migrants which was absolutely unprecedented.
« 700 migrants, peut-être plus. Le pire drame de l'immigration en Méditerranée. »
Una tragedia senza precedenti a 60 miglia dalla costa libica.
I still remember that the accident was on a weekend. We went to the ministers of foreign affairs and ministers of interior. One of the major points was actually the trebling of the amounts available for Frontex operations in order to move towards saving lives on the central Mediterranean route.
Let me say that having 41 European Union ministers sitting together at the same table with less than 24 hours notice is not just a sign of goodwill, but also and finally gives the idea of a new sense of urgency.
Depuis plusieurs mois, on sait que c'est un sujet majeur et que donc là on se dit on l'a vu, c'est pas quelque chose qu'on découvre et on ne peut pas empêcher de tels drames, on ne peut pas empêcher de tels événements tragiques. Et là, c'est vraiment une prise de conscience que tout ce que l'on a dit, et l'on a dit beaucoup de choses, n'aboutit pas au résultat que nous attendons, c'est-à-dire éviter ces drames et contenir la pression migratoire.
Saving the lives of innocent people is, of course, the number one priority for us. It will be a discussion about readiness to sacrifice some national interest for the common good. And this is always here the most challenging moment in our discussions.
La première décision qui est attendue, c'est de renforcer la présence de l'Europe en mer, mais également en surveillance.
Es geht hier die Akzeptanz der Europäischen Union, ihrer Werte weltweit. Und deshalb ist das Thema heute von allergrößter Wichtigkeit, gerade auch im Blick auf das Retten von Menschenleben.
I to jest moment, w którym Unia może pokazać swoją solidarność, nie tylko w słowach, ale również w bardzo konkretnych czynach.
À partir de ce moment-là, on a sauvé davantage de personnes, ce qui est évidemment un objectif fondamental, mais on a vu également de plus en plus de personnes arriver. Les routes ont changé, puisqu'on est passé de la Méditerranée centrale à la partie davantage à l'est.
It started out being about saving lives. Next, it became a matter of how do we do with the people who actually set foot on European territory? How do we redistribute them among member states?
I remember a discussion in Coreper when I said to the ambassadors, yes, we will save these people, but now then we need to know what we do with them.
La règle qui s'applique, c'est que le pays auprès duquel des migrants arrivent est responsable du traitement des demandes d'asile. Mais lorsque l'on a des milliers de migrants, on voit bien le poids énorme que cela peut représenter pour les pays de première entrée. Donc, l'idée est assez rapidement venue de se partager cette responsabilité.
We already in mid-May said that we would propose a relocation scheme, and then we had a rather difficult discussion between member states because there was this feeling that these measures should be decided on a voluntary basis. And so we had the camps voluntary versus mandatory.
Il y a des histoires différentes dans nos États membres. Dans les pays de l'Est de l'Europe, il n'y a pas de grande tradition récente, en tout cas d'immigration importante. Cette ouverture n'est pas quelque chose de naturel et de spontané.
Réellement, les pays de l'Est ont des sociétés plus homogènes. Il y a une crainte, une peur du différent.
Povinné kvóty nebudú. Zopakujem to ešte raz, povinné kvóty nebudú. Nikto nemôže povedať ani Českej republike, ani Slovenskej republike, toľko to musíte teraz migrantov zobrať v takejto a takejto kvalite.
We would like to be honorable with the immigrants also, because we cannot force them to go to the country they don't want.
There's also a dimension related to how attractive member states are as end destination for refugees. And therefore, I think that seeing this only in East-West terms is a gross simplification.
Les migrants donnent parfois l'impression de choisir. Donc, un des arguments des pays de l'Est de l'Europe consiste à dire « mais ces migrants ne veulent pas venir chez nous », ce qui n'est pas complètement faux.
So we had this difficult debate between the ones who thought they had already too many migrants, or the ones who said that they did not have any experience.
On a vu cette crispation. À un certain moment, j'ai mis tous les ministres autour de la table sont diplomates, et je leur ai dit, donnez-moi un nombre.
Il y a une première décision avec 40 000 personnes, dans un contexte où le Conseil européen avait dit qu'il fallait décider par consensus, qu'il n'y aurait pas de décision brutale à l'égard des États membres qui avaient des difficultés.
Pour la relocalisation, 40 000 à répartir, on était bloqué à 33 000. Voilà, c'était déjà un signal. Sur la base volontaire, pour moi en tout cas, on n'arrivera jamais à répartir plus de réfugiés.
So the summer came, and end of July, August, we had massive influx via the Greek islands, which meant that President Juncker, on the 9th of September, actually in his State of Union address, announced that we would come with a new relocation proposal of 120,000.
Il faut quand même partir du début du mois de septembre. Aylan, ce garçon de 5 ans, qui est mort, allongé mort sur la plage, c'était déjà fort. J'avais l'espoir, jusque peut-être quelques heures avant cette réunion qui était à 3 heures, qu'on était capable de trouver une solution, donc sur base politique, disons. Alors, à un certain moment, j'ai vu que ça ne marchait pas.
Et donc, la présidence, sous la pression de la nécessité de réagir, il faut réagir, on ne peut pas passer des mois à discuter ce genre de propositions. Le traité nous donne un outil qui est la majorité qualifiée.
Alors j'ai dit à certains d'entre nous, des ministres, j'ai dit, si ça ne passe pas, je passe au vote. Il y avait même à ce moment-là des gens des pays de l'Est qui m'ont dit, passe au vote, parce que pour nous c'est plus facile si c'est par vote que si on doit trouver un consensus. C'était pas facile, il fallait une majorité qualifiée.
Donc la présidence dit, voilà, nous allons nous compter. Et l'on verra. Les États, ils savent que c'est la règle du jeu. Ça ne leur fait pas particulièrement plaisir d'être mis en minorité, mais ils doivent s'y conformer.
Si on passe au vote et qu'on prend la décision, c'est une loi européenne. Il n'y a personne qui peut dire, moi je n'applique pas.
La relocalisation se fait une fois que les personnes, les migrants, sont arrivés dans ce que l'on appelle les hotspots, c'est-à-dire des endroits où l'on doit les enregistrer, identifier quels sont les vrais demandeurs d'asile et ceux qui sont plutôt des migrants économiques. Donc ça prend beaucoup de temps. Et puis, parfois, les migrants refusent de se faire enregistrer, ne veulent pas passer par ces zones, ces hotspots.
When you have a smuggler saying to you, in 2 days' time or 3 days' time, if you pay me 2,000 euros, I can get you to Munich, to Vienna. Or you have to go in a relocation process, not knowing whether you actually are going to end up in Luxembourg or in Sofia. A lot of the migrants take the other choice.
Il y a beaucoup d'argent qui se fait avec des organisations criminelles dans des conditions vraiment extrêmement choquantes. Donc les passeurs leur disent faites attention, ne vous faites pas enregistrer.
Il faudrait qu'on explique la relocalisation, ce que c'est. Ce n'est pas les mettre dans un avion et dans un camp. Non, mais c'est leur donner une chance pour pouvoir refaire leur vie dans un pays de l'Union européenne.
Nous accordons l'asile à des personnes qui sont menacées dans leur existence, dans les pays en situation de guerre, de conflit. Donc les personnes qui n'ont pas vocation à recevoir l'asile, normalement, doivent rentrer dans leur pays d'origine.
Il y avait des jours, au mois de novembre, où il y a eu des arrivées, 20 000 personnes sont venues rien que par Lesbos. C'est terrible. Hein. La Grèce a peur que d'énormes camps de réfugiés non relocalisables et non retournables se rassemblent donc en Grèce. Ça, c'est une peur qui m'a toujours été bien expliquée et je comprends.
It became clear that without stemming the flows, without getting down the numbers, we would simply not be able to cope with this crisis.
We have now reached a critical point today. We are talking about millions of potential refugees trying to reach Europe. In light of this, the most urgent question is how to regain control of our external borders.
As I see it, the summit on the 23rd of September was a key point in the development of the approach to the crisis. We thought that it was very important to broaden the agenda. What can we do in terms of making sure that once refugees come to Europe, that they are registered in hotspots, that we know who they are? What can we do to strengthen border controls? What can we do in cooperating with Turkey?
Dieser EU-Türkei-Plan wird auf der einen Seite deutlich machen, dass wir aus vielerlei Gründen enger mit der Türkei zusammenarbeiten werden. Denken wir nur an den Bürgerkrieg in Syrien, an den Kampf gegen IS, aber auch an die illegalen Migrationsbewegungen.
One of the complexities of dealing with this crisis is that this is not something we can just deal with within the Union. We need the African partners, and for those coming via the Eastern Mediterranean route, we need Turkey.
Turkey has, over the last 4 years, been taking the brunt of the Syrian conflict, with some over 2.3, 2.5 million Syrians actually being in Turkey. And we have, to a certain extent, comfortably looked away and said, the Turks are taking care of that, we don't need to bother about that.
Notre relation avec la Turquie, j'espère qu'on pourra la construire sur un peu plus de confiance. Parfois c'est difficile, ça c'est clair. Difficile peut-être pour les Turcs, mais aussi difficile pour nous.
Yes, we have to engage with Turkey because they have to make sure that irregular migration no longer takes place from Turkey to the Greek islands.
The Commission here negotiated already in October a draft action plan with a view to get a complete agreement with Turkey.
The Commission have actually developed a joint action program which has a number of different elements. An openness in as much as the enlargement negotiations are concerned, and then an overall discussion on visa liberalization.
Our key role was to make sure that what had been negotiated between the Commission and Turkey would also be acceptable to all 28 member states. That was not an easy task. We do need all member states on board, otherwise it won't work.
Let me state clearly that we do not expect anyone to guard our borders for us, but we expect a major step when it comes to stemming the migration flow that is coming to the EU via Turkey. We will also step up our assistance to Syrian refugees in Turkey through a new refugee facility of 3 billion euros.
C'est clair pour moi, les 3 milliards, on ne les donne pas au président turc ou au premier ministre turc ou au gouvernement turc, on les donne pour que 2 millions de réfugiés syriens puissent avoir une perspective, avoir un travail, en Turquie.
It is too early to say that it is bearing fruit. The glass is not full, but it's not empty either.
President Tusk said early on in the crisis, we need to regain control of our external borders, or it will be very difficult to get rid of the temporary internal border controls that have been put in place.
Nous avons un bien commun qui est la libre circulation à l'intérieur de l'espace dit Schengen. Ça ne peut fonctionner que si les frontières extérieures de l'Union européenne sont contrôlées. Mais si ce contrôle n'est pas correctement assuré, tout le monde est perdant. Et donc, il faut aider les pays à assurer correctement le contrôle des frontières extérieures.
The December European Council dealt with the proposal put forward by the Commission for a common border and coast guard, and that had a reception by the leaders that was even more positive than I would have expected.
We will have a new European border guard agency, which will be the follower to Frontex, hopefully.
Il faut se rendre compte ce que c'est Schengen. C'est le marché commun, c'est la libre circulation, c'est l'Europe du citoyen. Tout ça s'écroulera si Schengen est parti. Et c'est one shot. Une fois parti, ça ne reviendra plus.
Most meetings in the European Council are about things that really matter. Sometimes there are tensions, and that goes, of course, in particular for an issue like migration.
Sur cette crise-là, il y a des enjeux politiques très très forts, nationaux, dans presque tous les États membres. On voit bien, tous les chefs d'État, ils ont un engagement personnel, ils ont au niveau national des pressions, des difficultés, des questions, ils doivent répondre à leurs opinions publiques.
Their preparation is very important because preparation can contribute to ensuring that no one among the heads are surprised. They know already beforehand where we are heading. But the meeting as such, while sometimes taking place in a politically charged atmosphere, there's a strong collective understanding that the heads need to find solutions. Therefore, heads act very responsibly and work towards solutions.
Ce sont des enjeux qui interpellent très directement les citoyens et donc, je dirais, qui ont un certain impact sur la manière dont les élections se gagnent ou se perdent.
And some would often say that what we are doing is too little and too late. But the Union does have 28 member states, and we need to have member states on board. Otherwise, what we do will have no consequence, will not be implemented, will not work. And that is actually at the core of what we are doing all the time, trying to create real compromises.
Au niveau du Conseil, il y avait quand même un appui très très fort. Et je dois dire aussi qu'au niveau des pays, au téléphone, on pouvait parler encore avec tous les gens, même ceux qui avaient une autre position.
I personally think that we will be able to solve this crisis as we have solved previous crises. That is my firm conviction. It will probably take some time. I think that it will, along the way, be a rough ride, but I'm absolutely confident that at the end we will find solutions also here, and we will find solutions by doing more in common than we did before we came into this crisis. That is the normal evolution in European integration.
Right, so you've seen two different views of what has happened, two different viewpoints, two different narratives. What are we talking about? I mean, we've seen very different versions. There's the version of the refugees themselves that are crossing the Mediterranean. There's the version of private actors and NGOs that are trying to help them. There's the version of the European Union, within the Council, within the EU institutions. And everybody calls it a crisis. But in fact, what is a crisis? Is that a crisis? What has happened here? What has happened is we've seen large migration flows across the Mediterranean that have occurred before. This is not the first time, in fact, that we've seen larger flows of people across the Mediterranean, whether Adriatic, Gibraltar Straits, Canary Islands, etc. In the public's imagination, what we talk about is in fact a current crisis that started in 2015. But if we go back empirically, what we find is it didn't just start and pop up in 2015, but there was a long build-up and a number of years where we already had rising numbers in different countries being affected to different extents. Okay, at least this wasn't me. The ongoing migration flows very clearly have to be placed in a particular context. We have the context of the Arab Spring, that was seen as a process of democratization in North Africa and the Middle East that kind of turned out a little bit different. It turned out a little bit like a loss of control of governments. It turned into, in certain countries, certainly like in Egypt, a kind of restoration period that we currently enjoy. So it has to be seen in the context of a larger crisis that isn't necessarily just about migration. It is about something larger and bigger. When we look at the EU dimension, what we can see is very clearly is a lack of a clear EU strategy. We see various EU actions, but the larger picture in terms of, well, what is it that the EU actually wants to achieve? Well, we can say there isn't really a clear strategy in terms of what it wants to achieve. There's splits amongst different EU member states. Well, very clearly between some of the ones that are directly exposed, that put much more of an emphasis on search and rescue operations, Italy for instance, that also have an experience in search and rescue operations. Other countries, especially those that are less exposed, put far more emphasis on strong borders and argue in a way that their societies are not ready to welcome many more migrants and refugees. A number of those countries, you've seen it also in the video, you've seen it Czech Republic, Slovak Republic, Poland, a number of Eastern European countries that also have much less experience with immigration. But significantly, and here this is the interesting part, a number of those have significant experience with emigration. As you might remember from the Brexit debate, of course, there's a number of Eastern Europeans that are migrants in the United Kingdom and that have experienced the migrant experience from that perspective. So there's been a certain lack of understanding for one another, one might argue. What we also have is that we have governments and politicians that are afraid of populism and possible gains for populist right-wing parties. I mean, if we look across Europe, we've seen a rise in populism, a rise in far-right parties in a number of different countries. I mean, in Italy, you've seen the rise of certain populist countries. We've seen it in the United Kingdom. Of course, the rise of UKIP in particular, that was responsible of having a referendum on a membership of the European Union more generally. And then that was at least partially responsible for the United Kingdom's decision to leave the European Union. We saw a rise in general other countries. So very, very high opinion polls in France for the Front National and Marine Le Pen. In the end, we saw that the Front National got a historic share in the presidential elections of 34%. Nonetheless, the Front National lost the presidential elections. The president-elect, the current president, is now Emmanuel Macron, who campaigned on an explicitly pro-European platform. And subsequently, in the parliamentary elections, we saw losses again for far-right parties. We saw similar events also in the Netherlands with Geert Wilders, that seemed for a number of months in the opinion polls to be looking very strong. When it came around to the actual elections, the score went down a little bit. We saw German developments, the Alternative für Deutschland, AfD, which is a kind of a far-right movement in Germany. Just after the height of the refugee crisis, got to opinion polls around 16, even 70%. In some of the states, they got scores of 23%, which is unprecedented in Germany. What we see currently in the opinion polls, however, is that with the numbers of people arriving, the numbers in the opinion polls have gone down significantly again. So we see a share of around 7 to 8% in the current opinion polls. So from a 16, 17%, we see a kind of a drop of almost 10% for far-right movements. We see, however, strong far-right movements also in Eastern Europe. We see a very, very strong far-right movement in Hungary, for instance, that is constantly pushing the current Hungarian government towards further far-right steps in terms of their policy. We see a party in Poland that is in government that could be described as being on the verge of a far-right party in terms of its own rhetoric and policy. We see current opinion polls in the Czech Republic that would lend us to believe that the next Czech government will be far more to the right than what we currently have. It will probably be going in the direction that Hungary is going as well. So we will see increasing numbers also in the European Union where this is the case. Here, what needs to be pointed out is, of course, also the role of the media. In the United Kingdom, for sure, we've seen a very strong role of what I would call the far-right papers. For instance, the Daily Mail and a number of others, the Telegraph and so on, that are pushing an anti-foreigner agenda, an anti-migrant agenda, to kind of construct an image of a particular type of crisis that kind of leads to the state being out of control. I mean, you've heard it also in terms of the imaginations, the kind of constructions politically that you saw in the video. There was talk about borders being out of control. We're not controlling our border anymore. So this is, of course, also the slogan that was used in the Brexit debate. The Brexit debate was very much, we're not in control of our borders. The European Union has removed the control of our borders. The United Kingdom is no longer in control of its borders, so we need to regain control of our borders. That was one of the big slogans in the debate. You see that kind of slogan used by other far-right movements in a number of countries. It was most successful in the United Kingdom, but it isn't a solitary development in the European Union. In fact, we see that movement in a number of different countries. We also saw it in the United States, in fact. The elections of President Donald Trump was also linked to this sense, we need to build a wall, we need to control our borders. Again, one of the interesting things, I spoke at a conference in Austria, and there I talked a little bit about Schengen and how Schengen can be quite useful as a useful tool actually to counter terrorists, countering the narrative that actually Schengen is responsible for some of those terroristic developments. I put forward the argument that in fact it is thanks to Schengen that we don't see more of the problems that we're currently seeing, that without that. Now the argument that I asked people is, how effective do you think border controls really are? And across the European Union, there's not many countries that have purely national border controls. In fact, in Schengen, you have a mixture in some ways. So I took the examples of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has a full national border control. The United Kingdom is outside the Schengen area. It is fully in control of its borders, so to speak. So I asked people, okay, the United Kingdom has invested a lot of money in some of those instruments. One of the things that are used, for instance, are infrared cameras, right? So when lorries or cars come into the United Kingdom at the ports, they use those infrared cameras to detect whether there's a human heartbeat in the lorry or in the car. So I asked people, wonderful, these are great tools, so we should be able to detect all the terrorists, shouldn't we? We have these cameras that detect. So I asked people, how many lorries do you think are actually checked with those infrared cameras. So I ask you as well, what's the percentage of lorries that are actually checked by those infrared cameras? 5%. Exactly. 5% roughly are. And Britain. On the British side, how many of those lorries actually checked? 5%. So your chance of not being checked at all is 95%. So then you need to calculate the probability of, if you're checked, what's the probability of actually being detected? So then you're reducing it further. The probability is relatively high, but let's say we have a probability of then still 50, 60, 70% of you actually being detected. So if you have 5%, you're then reducing this further to about 2% roughly of you actually being detected. So the probability, if you're a terrorist, you're sitting in a lorry, the probability of getting through the national border control is roughly at 98%. Not such bad odds in terms of being able to get into the country. And then you compare that to the kind of Schengen instruments that you have, because in the Schengen instruments, you have a variety of different instruments. You have the various databases. I mean, I don't want to go into all of them. But if you put all of them together, this is something that the United Kingdom does not have. The United Kingdom does not have access to all of those kind of instruments. So if you then compare the probability of you being detected via the databases, and you compare that with the probability of you being detected by those infrared instruments, well, what you'll find is that those infrared instruments, or this idea of national border controls, even if you use a pure efficiency argument, is actually not efficient. Then one person in the audience stood up and told me, yes, but this is just outrageous. I mean, how can you say that, those control mechanisms don't work? Because you know what? In Austria, we now have those, temporary border controls, which is true. And it was a national politician, I will tell you from which party afterwards. And he said, ever since we have those national border controls, those temporary border controls, we've detected that crime has fallen around the border area. Okay, yes. So statistically, you have found that crime has fallen because you've installed those temporary border controls. That is indeed correct. But do you know why? Do you know why crime has fallen? And what kind of crime has fallen? If you look at the statistics exactly, what kind of crime has actually fallen? Well, mainly crime that has fallen is petty crime. So it isn't actually a number of terrorist attacks that have gone down. It isn't a number of people being murdered that has gone down. It's mainly petty crime, like somebody stealing a bike, and that sort of stuff that has fallen. So I said, well, you know what? If you put the number of police officers that you've put at the national border, and you put them out on the street, what you will find is statistically, crime will fall in this area. Crime will fall. But you have no idea why, because this is a completely rudimentary instrument. It's a very crude instrument. Of course, the more police officers you put on the street, crime falls. But it falls by accident. Of course, the more the police check every individual person, but this is, of course, the road into authoritarian dictatorship, right? If you're putting thousands and thousands of people on the street, you will see a reduction of bikes being stolen. But what you don't necessarily find is a reduction in terrorist attacks. What you don't necessarily find is a reduction in murder, because that's not how you catch these people, by just putting lots and lots of people on the street. So in fact, what you've done is you've put an awful lot of resources very inefficiently into an objective that is not your objective to start off with. The objective that supposedly the state is suggesting is that we should reduce terrorism, that we should reduce serious crime. But this is not the objective that you're actually achieving by putting all these people there at the national border. But if you use the instruments of Schengen, you actually do achieve objectives. You achieve objectives that on certain databases, you find people being detected. Of course, it relies on other instruments. So the whole system kind of links into one another. But the problem is that with national politicians, firstly, a lot of them don't really understand the instruments particularly well. And just as a background note, the person who was incensed by my debate was, of course, a politician by the Austrian Freedom Party, who was very much and very vigorously advocating that we should immediately stand by and put all the police officers at the border. There's also a perception in this crisis that the public opinion is overall not sympathetic towards asylum seekers. Well, actually, you need to look at that a little bit more carefully. I mean, you can find that in Germany, immediately at the height of the crisis, there was a very strong welcoming atmosphere. At the time, we had kind of slogans about welcoming of refugees. We had TV programs on German TV that were welcoming refugees. We had people going to the train stations and actually actively helping people. We had people suggesting we're taking people into our house, into our homes. So there were lots of people who were very much saying we should do something. We can't turn away. It is true that as numbers were continuing, we also saw a backlash to that. We saw a backlash. The famous stance that Angela Merkel had was, "Wir schaffen das," we will manage this, which was then portrayed in the media as not having a plan at all, as not being prepared. And in a sense, I also agree to an extent that the portrayal of what happened in Germany was also incorrect in the media to an extent. Because the way it was portrayed was that Germany, well, there's two versions of this actually. I give you both versions. On the kind of more left of the political spectrum, there's the version that Angela Merkel took a normative stance here, and she said, we need to let in the refugees. In a sense, I would argue this is slightly, how shall I say, wishful thinking as an interpretation. So she took a normative stance, we need to let in the refugees. On the right, especially the far right, there's the opposite spectrum. I even heard Marine Le Pen at the time of the crisis, she seriously suggested that far from that being a normative view, the decision by Germany to let in refugees was a decision to undercut workers on the German labor market with cheap foreigners, letting them all in so that wages would drop. Also a kind of crazy interpretation of what was happening. And I can give you lots of reasons of why that is crazy. I think both views are crazy. One, it is true that I don't think Angela Merkel's decision was a normative one, but it is also true that it wasn't a strategic one in the sense that Marine Le Pen suggested to undercut workers to let in lots of. Because if that had been the German objective, there's much better tools in terms of immigration policy of letting in cheap workers than letting in asylum seekers that you do not know what skills they have sporadically without controlling their entry. So this is kind of a crazy interpretation from that angle. But it's also crazy to suggest that it was normative. Why? Because basically the crisis did not start in 2015. The crisis started a number of years earlier. And in fact, if you go back a number of years, for instance, when Italy had very, very high numbers of people arriving in Italy, Germany was not at the forefront of countries saying, let's help Italy and let's take in thousands and thousands of asylum seekers to Germany. So Germany at the time was more of the view that this is Italy's problem. You're a big country, you have big borders, you know how to deal with them, we don't need to help you. That was the stance that Germany took at the time. So to suggest that within a year or two Germany would have changed its view is probably not very credible as a story. I think what is true, though, is that what we had there with Greece was something quite exceptional. Greece was clearly a country that was finding it very difficult to cope with the amount of people that were arriving in Greece, in terms of its infrastructure, in terms of its own debt crisis that was kind of co-occurring at the same time. And a number of European courts had very clearly said, we cannot send people back to Greece. Why? Because the kind of state that people are in Greece, that just cannot be. Belgian courts had decided that. German courts had decided that. A number of European courts had decided we cannot send back people to Greece because the conditions that they're in Greece, they're subhuman. They do not fulfill the standards that in law they have to fulfill. So even though Greece was obliged to fulfill certain standards according to European legislation, Greece was unable to fulfill that legislation. So there, what we have is a situation where, in fact, indeed, Greece could not cope with the numbers that it was dealing with. And in any case, people did not actually aim to stay in Greece, so they went up. They went up towards Germany, they went up towards Scandinavia. That was the main kind of route. They went through the Balkan route, which is also something that you saw in the movie. Went through the former Yugoslavia, kind of Macedonia, Serbia, went into Hungary. So actually, in 2015, you saw a huge spike in the number of people arriving in Hungary. And there, it would cause a political problem for most governments, particularly, of course, to a government that is leaning towards the right. Then people move on to Austria and Germany. In Hungary, I think an interesting thing to note about the statistics, because nowadays there's a certain myth in terms of how Hungary was able to close its borders. Yeah? Hungary was very tough. It kind of sent a message that people could not come in. It really erected fences so that people could not literally come in. It was trying to get those people that actually came, trying to get them out of the country. So there's this image that Hungary was very tough on the migrants, and in terms of the policy, that is probably true. Interesting is, though, the statistics. Did numbers actually go down from the moment that Hungary closed its borders? And there what you see is that numbers for a long time continued to be quite high in Hungary. So even though Hungary was erecting its fences, numbers did not just suddenly collapse, as people would make out nowadays, that, you know, because nowadays you have the two political versions. The one version that is, well, actually it's the migrant deal with Turkey that brought numbers down, that is portrayed by the more migrant-friendly press. And then you have the opposing view, which is, no, what really brought the numbers down is the fact that they closed down the Balkan routes. It's only because of Hungary, in a sense, that numbers have gone down. Well, to a certain extent, neither version is 100% correct, in the sense that the Balkan route did eventually close down, and that probably eventually brought down numbers, but not in the way in which it is portrayed, because for a number of months after it was supposedly closed down, numbers continued to be quite high. At the same time as suggesting that only the EU-Turkey deal did it is probably also incorrect, because of course two things should have, the important thing that should have happened if those interpretation is correct, is a complete diversion of the flow towards Italy. To an extent, we see that with numbers, that there is a diversion of flow towards Italy. We've seen numbers go up in Italy while numbers have dropped in Greece, but we do not see a one-to-one substitution. We see that it's a far more complex picture, that of course numbers have risen in Italy, numbers in Greece have gone down, but there is not a one-to-one substitution. So we do not see flows going one-to-one from Turkey towards Libya, towards Italy. We see some diversion. We also see some diversion towards Spain again, but we do not see a one-to-one substitution, which is what should have happened if those two arguments were 100% true. But let's go towards analyzing a little bit the causes of this crisis that are, in a sense, home to the European Union, and that is the common European asylum system. Let me give you a little outline of some of the things that you've seen in the video. Well, what exactly is dysfunctional about the European asylum system that would cause some of these problems? The temporary European Council, this is in 1999, decided to establish a common European asylum system. In fact, it was something that was already written into the Amsterdam Treaty, but that was reaffirmed as a kind of strong normative message by the temporary European Council of 1999. At the time, it had three dimensions. The main goal was the harmonization of asylum legislation, and here I'm talking about the procedures of asylum, the qualification for asylum, the reception conditions for refugees, temporary protection, and the Dublin regulation. It also contained flanking measures. Here, in terms of practical cooperation, this later becomes the European Asylum Support Office and so-called solidarity measures. The origins of the system, in fact, are significant disparities amongst the different asylum systems that existed already across the European Union in the 1990s. We had very strong regulators and we had weak regulators in terms of asylum systems. One of the strong ones at the time was, of course, Germany. Germany had, at the time in the early 1990s, it had in its constitution an article that said that people had a right to asylum. This changed in 1993. 1993 was the year when there was a huge spike in asylum applications in Germany. 1.5 million people at the time applied for asylum in Germany. Where did they come from at the time? Primarily it was the Yugoslav wars. So a lot of the people came from the former Yugoslavia, from the different countries of the former Yugoslavia. And as a result of that and kind of some far-right attacks, Germany then reformed its own constitution. But I think in general we can say there are strong regulators, and the strong regulators of asylum regulations wanted the weak regulators to strengthen their borders so that numbers would go down and to adapt more generous asylum policies. Because the argument was that in a sense refugees, asylum seekers are benefit chasing. So they will go to the country where they have the expectation to get higher benefits. Venue shopping, you might call, or asylum shopping here. So the assumption underneath the system is that this so-called asylum shopping would lead to strong regulators receiving a higher burden of asylum seekers. Burden here in inverted commas. This higher burden would then, in a sense, fall on those countries that are more generous, whereas those countries that are less generous would receive less of a burden. Therefore, in that view, harmonization of asylum policies across the EU should lead to less secondary movements being the movements that occur as a result of this kind of asylum shopping across the EU, and would lead to a more equitable burden sharing. If we take the view from the asylum seekers, though, there is no, in the 90s, there's no functioning asylum system in those countries that are weak regulators. Problem of access, for instance. If you take some countries, for example, take Spain in the 1990s. Yeah? Spain, in a sense, has an exposed geographical position. It's close to the Moroccan coast, so people should get into Spain relatively easily. What we see, however, is that asylum applications in Spain are not particularly high in the 1990s. In fact, they're very low, even though a lot of people come into Europe in the 1990s already. But in Spain, numbers are very low. So why is that? Why are numbers in Spain low in the 1990s? Part of the reason is problems of access to the system. So national asylum systems in weak regulators are designed in such a way that people find it very difficult to access the asylum system should they wish. So whether they can apply for asylum, who they can apply to for asylum, who decides on their claim, all of these systems are designed in such a way that it's not favorable to the person. So people do avoid those kind of states because it doesn't work very well. But there lacks border controls in some of those countries, possibilities to stay and work in the country irregularly. So in a sense, if we look at a country for Spain, like Spain, the numbers that we need to look at are not the numbers for asylum applicants, because they will only tell us that they will not get many people. But the numbers that we really need to look at in those countries is the numbers of irregular migrants. And if we look at the numbers, and those are only estimates, but in Spain they're very accurate estimates, the numbers are actually very high, but they're not asylum applicants. They are recorded as irregular migrants because they cannot access the system as it exists. But they can actually live quite comfortably in Spain with the irregular status. They can find work. They can even send their kids to school. They can access the healthcare system because Spain has a system called the Padrón, where people used to be able to register on it. So even though they were irregular migrant with no legal right to stay in Spain, there was a parallel bureaucratic system that allowed them access to health service, to indirectly the labor market, to schooling. So you actually had a system that kind of worked for these people. It's just that they were not appearing as refugees in the statistics because they were on a different statistic that you needed to look at. The irregular status was not always very clear-cut. So this is the so-called Padrón system in Spain. So you have, initially, there was a fear, therefore, in the Common European Asylum that is a race to the bottom, as the EU only sought to establish common minimum standards. If you go into the treaties, we look at the Treaty of Amsterdam, the treaties specify minimum standards. Now, people therefore feared, if the terminology is that of minimum standards, that many EU member states would only do the rational thing, bring their asylum standards to the absolute minimum, even if they have to use higher standards. But in practice, we saw this was not really happening. What we saw is that actually, for a lot of countries, having these minimum standards raised standards significantly. Not in all ways, and there's caveats to all of this, but if we look a number of countries, for instance, Spain, and I'm saying that because I've just talked about Spain, the minimum standards meant that now, in the revised version of the policy, asylum seekers can actually apply in a system that works, not perfect, but better than what there was before. So they're able to actually get into the system, which before they were not able to get in. In a number of other countries, the same is true in Malta, for instance, another one of those countries where people were completely unable to access the asylum system before. Actually, with the Common European Asylum System, increasingly migrants can actually access to an extent, and there are caveats, but to an extent they can access the system. So overall, In terms of standards, we see a rise in the asylum standards in those countries that are weak regulators, and we see higher standards that are kept in stronger regulators. So what we see is those countries that previously had higher standards, they maintain those higher standards. We don't see a huge drop in those countries, but we see in those countries that had weak standards, we see that there's a rise in the standards. In particular, strong regulators played a key role in these negotiations because they have more expertise and experience in asylum matters. They're more active in the negotiations. For instance, countries like France, making sure that they're trying to align EU standards to their own national legislation. So their own national legislation, which tends to be higher, which tends to be more generous, they want to see that reflected in EU standards. So successive EU treaty reforms have given away more powers to more refugee-friendly institutions. So within Brussels, we can see that refugees have, in a sense, managed to develop a policy that is more favorable, that institutions have developed a policy that's more favorable. Here in particular, I'm talking about the European Commission, the European Parliament, and of course the European Court of Justice. If you look at the people in the Commission that work on asylum matters, you will find that a number of them have experiences of either working in NGOs beforehand. A number of them do actually care about refugees. They did work in kind of areas related. You see a much stronger influence of the European Court of Justice. You see an increasing organization in Brussels of pro-migrant NGOs that in the early 1990s did not exist to the extent that it exists now. NGOs are much better organized in Brussels now than they used to be organized in the early 90s. And what is very important is the importance of the courts and legal texts. Here, I want to point out the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, because Article 16 in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights actually gives refugees the right to asylum. This, if you know something about refugee rights, is something quite revolutionary, because the foundational text for refugee rights is, of course, the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Convention only gives refugee the right of non-refoulement, so not to be pushed back to the country where they are being persecuted. That's the right according to the Geneva Convention. The EU Charter of Fundamental Rights goes much further in that it actually provides for a right to asylum, which is stronger than the right to non-refoulement in text. There's also the European Convention on Human Rights and the Strasbourg jurisprudence and the interplay between Strasbourg and Luxembourg and its verdicts. So you see more legal texts that solidify the rights of refugees, and you see courts being able to use some of those texts that previously they were not able to use. And that's why you see an increase in terms of legal rights of refugees, but here I need to make a qualification of refugees that are accepted. And I think that's where we're coming to the problem of the system in a little moment. We also see attempts, although limited, at strengthening solidarity and assistance towards weaker regulators. Here we have the European Asylum Support Office and the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund to kind of help and strengthen. However, the counter-argument here is that some scholars have suggested, well, standards could have been set at a higher level. If we look at the competences of the European Union, according to the Lisbon Treaty, the European Union, since 2009, has had the competence to have a fully harmonized common European asylum system. That's the competence as it is written in the Lisbon Treaty. However, when you see the revisions, the second revision of the common European asylum system, you see that it was still adopted as common minimum standards, despite the fact that the Lisbon Treaty had already overtaken that in terms of legal competence. Still, what is adopted are still common minimum standards. So here, I've said it for many years, why didn't the Commission go much further? Legally, it can already harmonize, but it didn't do so. Some countries are also not implementing EU standards. I've pointed out, for instance, Greece, that haven't fully implemented EU standards, and a number of courts kind of said in so much that those standards are not implemented, and therefore they're not willing to send people back to those countries. Some people therefore argue that the core of EU asylum migration policies developed outside the EU was restrictive and therefore largely remains so. Even if the courts, as I just suggested, can play a positive role, it takes, of course, a longer time. So what, therefore, is not working? And I think here we're coming really to the point that is not working. The problem is, of course, the Dublin system. And you heard it at the beginning of the video. What is the Dublin system? The Dublin system is this idea that asylum applicants have to apply in the first country where they arrive in the European Union, and that's where the application of asylum should be lodged. That's a country where they should be, in a sense, claiming asylum. The problem here is that, of course, that means that geography, in a sense, favors some countries over other countries. That means it is perceived as an inherently unfair system. It's inherently unfair. There's a historical reason for that system, why it has existed. Something to do with the 1990s, because of course the Dublin regulation that currently exists builds on a Dublin Convention as it was written in 1990, where that principle was established. But countries increasingly see that system as an unfair system, right? Why is it that those countries in the Mediterranean that are geographically exposed need to get a higher burden than those countries that are not? So this means that some countries seem to be unable and maybe unwilling to respect those rules. And here you can make arguments about, legitimate rules and rules that are seen as illegitimate, and how well you can then implement those rules. But usually the governments would argue that they are overburdened. Italy, for instance, has made that argument a number of times. There's also a lack of solidarity amongst EU member states. What we see is that there's a lot of talk about solidarity, but when solidarity measures are meant to actually be implemented, they don't work completely. So the problem here is, of course, even in the revisions of Dublin, what we see is not a complete questioning of the Dublin mechanism. As such, the Dublin mechanism still continues to exist, and therefore we see continuing loss of life and a booming human smuggling industry, trafficking industry that kind of benefits from these kind of discrepancies. And here I want to connect this a little bit to our ongoing project, which is the impact of the refugee crisis in the Mediterranean on the common European asylum system. So in this particular project, we're trying to figure out to what extent has the Syrian refugee crisis led to the development of new norms and practices in the common European asylum system. Kind of linked to what I was presenting at the beginning. The theoretical framework, as we're using it, is building on John Kingdon's model and on my own model in my own book, that of a multiple stream analysis. And here there's 4 streams. I mean, it basically has a concept of politics as a kind of non-sequential, kind of, some people call it garbage can, but kind of basically the idea here is that there are different streams in terms of how politics develop. There's a problem stream, how a problem is constructed. There's a proposal stream, what kind of policy solution you put forward. And then there's a politics stream in terms of how, in a sense, decisions are taken. Most people think of those things as sequential, yeah? Most people idea, the logical way in which these things are occurring is first you identify a problem, then you develop a solution, and then you decide on a solution. But the idea of this model is that it doesn't happen sequentially, that in fact you have these streams operating according to their own logic in a non-sequential way at different times. So for instance, you can have people developing solutions for problems that are not recognized as political problems. You can have decision-making that precedes some of the problem construction. And here, in my own model, I suggested that underneath those three streams, what steers those streams, and here I'm linking it to international relations constructivism, is that of a normative stream, that the way in which a problem is constructed is built on the current of normative streams that is prevalent in the political system. The kind of solutions that are found to problems is linked again to the existing prevailing norms as it is perceived, and the politics or the decision making, who can take a decision with whom, is also linked on the normative stream, the kind of norms that are being pushed. And here there's a concept of policy entrepreneurship. Policy, when all of these streams converge, so they kind of come together, then there's a policy window where policy entrepreneur can push those kind of policies that are standing there. Norms in this particular conceptualization, we've defined them as written or non-written rules, which are reasons for action of different orders. So reasons for action is why should you be doing something. Norms are the kinds of written or non-written rules that are linked to why you should or should not be doing something. They enable, restrain, or constitute different actions by providing a standard of appropriate behavior for a particular reference group. Now, if we look at the Common European Asylum System, we can see that there have been core norms established. We have cooperation on asylum and migration matters amongst European states, first outside the framework of the EU. There we have the establishment of the first core norm of the Common European Asylum System, and that is the country of first entry should be responsible for the processing of the asylum claim. It's the core norm of spontaneous arrival. And linked to that, we see the development of Norm 2. Each state is responsible for the processing of its own applications. So these norms were already developed at the beginning of the system at a time when the EU was not responsible for refugees yet. There were, even before the Treaty of Maastricht, these norms were already developed by the different countries. The Treaty of Maastricht then in 1990 granted the EU competences on asylum. A number of other norms were then established with the Treaty of Maastricht. And norm number 3 is EU countries need to be in compliance with the Geneva Convention. This is in Article K2 of the Maastricht Treaty. Norm 4 is countries need to be in compliance with the European Court of Human Rights. And in fact, indirectly through the Treaty of Maastricht, and then even more importantly through the Treaty of Amsterdam and the Treaty of Lisbon, we have EU pooling of sovereignty as increasingly a core norm for asylum matters. The Common European Asylum System, in fact, the decision at the time of the European Council of Tampere was to establish this Common European Asylum System, here with the 3 dimensions, the harmonization of asylum legislation, procedures, qualification, and so on, flanking measures. But the underlying assumption of the system is that of spontaneous arrivals of asylum seekers. So our argument that we're making is that in fact, the asylum system, as it was created at the very beginning, is disorganization by design, because it takes the assumption that asylum seekers are only spontaneously arriving. It does not take the assumption that you have an organized process in which asylum seekers and refugees could be organized. It is a reactive process. So the common European asylum system, at its very core, was constructed in such a way that it in a sense, designs the whole system as a disorganization, as an unplanned, spontaneous process. So what could be new norms? What new norms could be established? And how far have they been established? Well, one of the norms that could be established is, for instance, solidarity. Yeah? Solidarity could be a new core norm in a common European asylum system. Politicians have been talking about solidarity for many years. Yeah? It's not something new that is on the agenda. But is it actually established in the system? Well, solidarity as a new core norm would mean a complete reform of the Dublin system. It would mean that you have a complete physical redistribution of asylum seekers. Because at the moment, you have the main core norm, which is the Dublin norm, which is the kind of two norms that I just told you, the country of first entry responsible for the processing of asylum claims, and each state is responsible for the processing of its own applications. Now, if we look at constructivism, the thing about norms is that they never enter a vacuum. Yeah? Norms do not appear out of thin air. In order for a new norm to appear, it usually needs to replace an existing norm. So norms are, in a sense, in competition with one another. So what we see here is the norm that does not exist, the kind of norm in construction, as it were, of solidarity, is directly in competition with the norms of country of first entry responsible for the processing and the norm 2, each state responsible for the processing of its own competition, of its own applications. Another possible norm that could exist is that of non-compliance with the Geneva Convention. So in a sense, you could have a norm that could appear, in a sense, we should be sending people back. Some people have been making that argument, not across Europe, but in a British political context, there were politicians that have seriously suggested whether Britain should be part of the Geneva Convention. Britain, as a member of the European Union, could never leave the Geneva Convention because it was included in the treaties. Post-Brexit, Britain, however, is no longer bound by the European treaties and could, in theory, leave the Geneva Convention and therefore establish a new norm which could be that of refoulement in contradiction to the non-refoulement principle of the Geneva Convention. Another norm, as it could be developed, is that of non-compliance with the European Court of Human Rights. Again, this is not common standard to be discussing this in the European Union, but again in Britain the argument has been made that a post-Brexit Britain will leave the European Convention on Human Rights. At the moment, Britain as a member of the European Union cannot leave the European Convention on Human Rights because the treaty mandates every EU member state to be also a member of the European Convention on Human Rights. Post-Brexit, Britain, however, is no longer bound by the EU treaties and could leave the European Convention on Human Rights. In fact, before Theresa May's disastrous election in June, the idea was that probably the Tories are going to have an election in 2020. The general assumption in 2020 was that Theresa May is going to go into that election in 2020 promising the end of British membership of the European Convention on Human Rights. So the general assumption was the Tories are going to promise that in the election campaign, and post-2020 are going to actually remove Britain from the European Convention on Human Rights. Things have gone differently, so we will have to see what might happen in the future, whether post-Brexit Britain 2022, which is when the next British elections are going to be held, will in fact argue that withdrawing from the European Convention on Human Rights is a possibility, but this could have been something that another norm that could have occurred is the mutual recognition of asylum decisions or EU common system to process asylum applications, either inside or outside the system. To an extent, the European Commission has been trying to push this, has been trying to have a common system also for countries possibly processing applications outside the framework of the European Union. This debate is also old. In a sense, Tony Blair first suggested that the EU could be processing asylum applications from outside the European Union. However, Tony Blair at the time suggested this would replace the processing of asylum applications inside the European Union, to which the European Commission then jumped on board and suggested, how great, let's do both, which then effectively killed the idea of processing outside. Reverting back to the pre-existing norms, which is that countries are, in a sense, dealing with their own applications. But in theory, it could be a possibility, a new norm could be established, that in fact asylum applications should be processed inside and outside. It would eventually get rid of this idea that it's, in a sense, organized chaos, organized disorganization, as the asylum is at the moment, which relies only on spontaneous applications and not necessarily on what some other countries, for instance Canada, are doing, where they're kind of looking at refugees outside their own borders and then taking some people in. Admittedly, the numbers are relatively limited, but in theory one could also expand that kind of system. So what happened in the refugee crisis? In the refugee crisis, we had more than 1 million people that crossed into Europe in 2015, as we saw in the video, mainly by sea, some overland via Turkey and Albania. Conflict in Syria was the main driver, but also asylum seekers were coming from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. About 475,000 asylum claims were made in Germany in 2015, and of course we saw a significant loss of life, more than 5,000 people in 2016. So did that provide a policy window? Is this a good crisis, in a sense, to push through a new policy? Well, widely held views were illegal entry, well, is often required. Yeah? In a sense, in order to apply for asylum status, you have to, in fact, get into the territory of a member state. In order to get onto the territory of a member state, for most people, they don't exactly get a humanitarian visa to come in and then apply for asylum. Usually, they just have to get in and then apply for asylum. But the entry itself is therefore made illegally. For most people, this is the case. Some people have a valid visa, maybe for tourism purposes, but in a sense, while then the entry is legal, the stay itself becomes illegal also because they're not really a tourist. So whichever way you put it, in a sense, illegal entry is often required. Many applications for asylum are therefore then turned down. It is difficult to return asylum seekers, however, whose application has been rejected. Why? Well, a number of countries don't take them back. Yeah? In order to get countries to take them back, you often have to have an agreement. Then there's a dispute whether they're really their own national. Sometimes their papers are destroyed. It's not so easy to actually return rejected asylum seekers. There's a huge loss of life, which we also saw in the video. So it's very clear that the current asylum system, as I said, disorganized and in a sense chaotic from its own inception, is not working. So one would argue there's a policy window. The European Commission, in fact, is pushing for safe and legal ways for those in need of protection. The European Commission is, in fact, pushing for that. But if we look at the EU response, what we find is a flurry of activities, meetings, political statements, new legislative initiatives. For instance, in 2016, the European Commission proposes to reform the Common European Asylum System, here to reform the Dublin Regulation, to reform the Asylum Procedures Regulation, to reform the Qualifications Regulation, to reform the Reception Conditions Directive. However, if you look into the detail of what the European Commission proposes, it proposes no major change. It proposes the preservation of the existing norms, norms 1 to 4 that I just told you at the beginning, norm to 5, country first entry responsible. Each state responsible for processing its own application. Compliance with Geneva, compliance with ECHR, and pooling EU sovereignty. None of those core norms are touched by the reform package. However, at the same time as proposing no major change, the Commission also proposes a major change. The Commission also proposes a major change, and that is the proposal for a permanent EU resettlement framework here in July 2016, with the aims to establish a common set of standard procedures for the selection of resettlement candidates and a common protection status for persons resettled to the EU. This in itself is a proposed normative change. It's a huge normative change, in fact, because the underlying norm in this proposal is that of solidarity. That's the underlying norm. However, this is not a norm that is currently accepted amongst EU member states. It's not a norm that exists in the current European asylum framework as we know it. So the background proposal here is the decision by EU member states to resettle 22,504 persons in need of international protections. There's 2 council decisions establishing a temporary emergency relocation scheme in September 2015, so relocation being internal resettlement within the EU. EU member states then commit themselves to relocate 160,000 people from Italy and Greece by September 2017, so by September of this year. And after year 1, only 3% of the target is met. About 3,000 asylum seekers that are actually resettled. How does that bode? The EU-Turkey Joint Action Plan, here October, November 2015, exists that provides also a voluntary humanitarian admission scheme with Turkey for Syrian refugees. However, a lack of support given to Greece and Italy. The EU-Turkey statement of March 2016 basically established a principle: 1 Syrian being returned to Turkey from Greece, 1 Syrian resettled from Turkey to the EU as of the 4th of April 2016. Significant opposition to this kind of scheme, to mandatory resettlement, because it's seen as a pull factor. So, how much have we seen the emergence of new norms? Like I said at the beginning, the theory suggests that new norms do not emerge in a vacuum, but they need to replace existing norms. And that's the fundamental contradiction within the Commission proposal. And that, in a sense, is our argument why that proposal will not work, cannot work, and will eventually not succeed. There's a preservation of old norms at the heart, and here that is the Dublin system, that continue in the Commission's proposal. The Commission does not suggest touching those old norms at all. It suggests preserving them, while at the same time the Commission is also pushing for new norms that are directly in contradiction to the old norms that it suggests it should not touch. You cannot have a system that excludes solidarity while at the same time pushing for a system that includes solidarity, because that's basically what the Commission is doing, that it preserves the old norms while pushing for new norms. As a result, our argument in this particular crisis is the Commission is completely unable to act as a norm entrepreneur. It cannot construct new norms into the system because it is unwilling to let go some of the old norms that are in direct competition to the new norms that it pushes. So it is contradictory. It's a failure of the policy proposal that is built on new norms but is not suggesting to replace some of the old norms, and is trying to push both at the same time, which is a contradiction, therefore cannot work.